Emphasis on land reform. Asset poverty often lies at the core of poverty. Inaccessibility to land is one of the fundamental determinants of poverty, and land redistribution is a powerful weapon against poverty. Lack of assets is an effect as well as a cause of poverty in terms of income opportunities, consumption, capability building of people and their institutions. Access to land and natural resources, invariably, have defined not only economic but also social and political deprivation of the masses of the developing world.
There are about 37 billion acres of habitable land across the world. Indigenous people and local communities occupy 65% of it. And yet these groups, a population of 1.5 billion, barely own 18% of the land they occupy. So much land in the world is owned by so few. Throughout history, people in power use land to control economic resources and retain political control, further exacerbating inequality. Thankfully, there's a fix. It's called land reform. Land reform means changing the law to change who owns the land. It's a radical idea, transforming the very root of power. Land reform can take land from the ruling class and give it to the historically oppressed. There are numerous goals of land reform: reducing poverty, expanding rural development, returning land to its previous owners. However, there are dangers. Land reform can mean seizing land from people without any redress. And throughout history, it's caused violence and started revolutions. However, the world is facing a massive population explosion. And the pressure on land for food, water, and housing is growing. Readdressing how land is used is an urgent issue. Can humanity afford to keep so much land in the hands of so few?
The land reform which was carried out in Japan between 1946 and 1950 is regarded as one of the most successful of the land reforms and has become the model for land reform in other countries. The land reform process started in Japan with the enactment of Farmland Adjustment Law of 1938 and the Owner-Farmer Establishment Special Measures Law in 1946. The purpose of land reform was to reduce the wide gap between absentee landlords who owned agricultural land but did not farm it themselves, and tenant farmers who rented the land in exchange for giving the landlord a high proportion of the crop. The land reform laws were intended to limit the amount of farmland one household could own to about the amount of land that one family could farm themselves, without outside labor. The government forced absentee landlords to sell all their land to the government. As the first step of the execution of the program, members of the village land committees were elected in December 1946 and those of at the prefecture level in February 1947. As the occupation forces ordered that the reform had to be accomplished within 2 years, the first compulsory purchase was done in March 1947, just after the elections of the committees. The purchase was successively executed over 10 times and 1,630,000 hectares of the farmland was acquired by the government by the end of 1948. The acquired land was immediately sold to cultivators. How thoroughly the conversion of these tenants into owner-farmers was carried out may be gauged by referring to Figure 1. The figure shows that tenant farmers, who before the war had accounted for nearly one-third of the total, accounted for 5%, by 1950, while part owner farmers, who had accounted for 40% of the total before the war, accounted for somewhat more than 30%. On the other side, the owners, who before the war accounted for 30% of the total, now accounted for 62%. The same situation is apparent in the light of the land statistics, and we find that land cultivated in tenancy, which before the war had accounted for nearly 50% of cultivated land, had shrunk by 1950 to around 10%. In addition, we must note in connection with the figure that although the land reform itself was completed in 1950, the numbers of owner-farmers have been increasing from that time up to the present day. In 1965, owners exceeded 80% of the total, while tenants accounted for less than 2%.